addiction scientist. Essentially, the question I've been trying to answer for the last 15 years is, to what extent or what impact has information technology had on gambling behavior? And I guess addressing a less popular question in academia, which is, can developing technology actually help people gambling in a more safe, controlled environment and fashion? Okay, so one of the, I guess, two questions I was asked to address here is, first of all, what is a typical online gambler like? What types of behaviors do they engage in? And the second question I was asked is, given some of the RG tools that we already talked about this morning, such as pre-commitment, are they actually very effective? So there are actually very two difficult questions to address, simply because the evidence base isn't there. There's two major flaws with the evidence base. The first one is that a lot of the research that we look at tends to separate online gamblers versus offline gamblers, trying to understand what are the differences here. Now, what we see is that most people who gamble online also gamble offline. As you can see from the British Gambling Prevalence Survey, it's very rare that somebody gambles just online. So in fact, when we're comparing these two groups of just online versus offline, we're actually having a false comparison because they're not representative of normal online gambling. The second problem that we have with the research is that often the research tends to clump together all the different forms of gambling, whether it's bingo, casinos, poker, whatever it is. Because they're all online, they tend to group them as just being very similar, when we know structurally they're extremely different. And on the basis of that, the behavioral patterns that we see on it are going to be very different as well. So from that, I would suggest we need to be very cautious about determining effectiveness of responsible gambling tools, because again, the behavior is different. To give you a very brief example of this, we know that for online casino gambling, length of session is actually a sign of harm. It's a predictor of risk. Yet when it comes to online poker, that's not the case whatsoever. Length of session has no effect whatsoever. So we need to be very cautious about our interpretation of this. But, you know, given that there is very little research, it doesn't mean we can do nothing. We have to interpret best as we can from what's available. Now, as Joachim identified, the vast majority of online gamblers do so in a responsible way. For the most case, it's moderate, it's occasional, it's not tied to harm. But at the same time, we must acknowledge the research shows that if you gamble online, you're also more likely to meet the criteria for problem gambling. Now, a superficial interpretation of that would suggest that, well, there must be some kind of inherent or intrinsic harm with gambling online. It must be potentially a cause here for problematic gambling. Unfortunately, we can't make that determination because there is no causal evidence. All we can say at the minute is it's an associated risk. Now, what we mean by that is, if you're a problem gambler, research shows very clearly that you're more likely to gamble across a wide range of activities, across a wide range of mediums. If you're likely to gamble online, you're also likely to gamble offline as well. So in this kind of vacuum of evidence that we have, we need to progress theoretically. And we need to consider what is, I guess, the theoretical harm in relation to online gambling. Essentially, what research shows is that when players engage in activities that are rapid and enable continuous gambling, in the sense that you can re-gamble very quickly over and over again, you get your result and you can rebet quite almost immediately. When players play those types of games, that's often associated with dissociative states, okay? Dissociative states essentially is whenever an individual has, I guess, to put it technically, low information vigilance. They're not really assessing potential harms. They're not really putting much stock and actually really thinking about, can I afford to lose this? Should I continue? What's the implications of losing? Because they're essentially in an excited, aroused state of dissociation. When this occurs, that's when basically people can overspend. They spend more money or more time than they thought they needed, or that they thought they could have. When the kind of realization occurs, often we're met with an emotive state, frustration, people become irritated, they become nervous, scared. So this can precipitate chasing behavior, which essentially is online gambling-related harm, and that's what we're trying to avoid. Now, this might be a little bit controversial, but it seems to be really in vogue in research at the minute to try and identify or try and develop behavioral models for predicting who's going to experience harm. I personally think that might be overextending ourselves, certainly from an operator perspective, simply because we have incomplete information. As we know, problem gamblers gamble across a wide range of activities, across various mediums. So, for example, we may have their online behavior, but we also are missing their offline gambling behavior. Also, from the research we did with Ecogra a few years ago, we show that most online gamblers have a multitude of sites. So although an operator may be able to access data of what's going on with their site, that customer probably has a couple more sites that we have no access to. So essentially, we're trying to build models across, with pretty much a small section of the data. So therefore, I think, from my perspective and as an academic, I think before we kind of get into the more nuanced forms of harm reduction, I think we need to focus more on doing well what we can do. The first point is we need to signpost. Essentially, when the customer does the hard work and identifies to us that they have a problem, obviously they need to be handled with care. Obviously, operations need to stop with that customer, including, which seems to be quite a problem, is stopping the marketing information going to this group. We see that evidence that that's not always the case. And as you can imagine, that's a very, I guess, with an international customer base, signposting them to the relevant services in their area is obviously going to be very difficult. The second issue, again, we talked about it quite a few times this morning, is informed choice. Essentially doing what we can to break that level, that kind of dissociation that can occur when people are playing. Not just educating them about the risks. We see that, again, from the evidence, that doesn't always work. People are aware of the risks, they know what's going to happen, but in that kind of frenzy or in that moment of arousal, they're not drawing on their rational cognitive senses. They're basically just on almost automaticity, on autopilot, if you will. So again, that's where the operator can intervene and educate or even recommend they use the various responsible gambling tools. Now again, with the research that I've done with Ecogra and various other studies internationally, we have a bit of a contradiction here. We see the customers actually really value these RG tools. They think stuff like pre-commitment is an excellent thing. In fact, it often enhances trustworthiness. They appreciate operators doing this. At the same time, they say still, well, it's great that I have it, but it's not really for me. It's for the people who can't control their behavior. And of course, as individuals, we don't want to identify with this group that has no control. So for me, that's the big, I guess, challenge we have as both academics and operators is trying to, I guess, change this attitude. I think, again, maybe controversial, but I think the perspective is, or there's a bit of a misconception, I think, with operators, that RG tools are some way to help with problem gambling. Essentially, I think once somebody's a problem gambler, the idea of a voluntary or even a mandatory tool, given that they play in other operators and other mediums, the idea of restrictions with a group who are already committed, already displaying patterns of lack of control, lack of self-regulation, it's a stretch considering that, assuming that they'll go ahead and set their own limits. Rather, what RG tools are they're for all customers. They're for non-problem gamblers. And especially, we need to get away from this idea that you only use these limits whenever you're experiencing harm. For me, that's too late. There's something that should be presented and promoted for all players. And again, I'm not being naive, thinking that's going to be an easy thing. But again, I look back at other kind of risk interventions, such as the seatbelt, for example. Whenever that law was introduced, everybody was up in arms. How dare people tell me how to behave and take my own risks in my car? But now, 20 years later, the attitudes have changed through education, through that continual reinforcement that this needs to be done. So I do think there can be a culture change. It's not going to be easy, but it's something we need to look forward towards in the next decade or so. I think one area that we could make strong leaps here is the use of social media. In the United Kingdom, I think from a marketing perspective, operators are really clued into the power of social media, such as Facebook groups. What we see is that it creates basically a community of online gamblers. And again, it's a very quick, rapid way for operators to engage with these customers. And obviously, it's a bi-directional pathway as well. But in terms of changing attitude to risk and the getting away from the idea of using RG tools as simply as something for people who can't control themselves, getting rid of that idea needs to be customer-led. And again, with these online communities through social media, we can kind of promote this attitude. It's been extremely successful through other public health campaigns, such as changing attitudes towards mental disorders and seeking help for mental disorders. I think it's something that needs to be investigated regarding responsible gambling too. If we flip back slightly to signposting, again, just based on the very limited research we have here, the existing research shows that we perhaps need to look at training of employees again. Essentially, two things are coming out. The first thing is that there seems to be a bit of ambiguity or a bit of uncertainty regarding the extent the operator or the customer service representative actually needs to take seriously these responsible gambling interventions. Again, because of the obvious contradiction between having, taking care of our customers who are at risk and also the commercial interests. And again, I think one of the key ways around that is to have more emphasis on management of this, including stuff in terms of performance appraisals, looking at to what extent have they been successful in providing rewards for successful interventions. It seems, again, from the limited research that we have, this doesn't seem to be taking place. Second of all, when asking the operator employees about their interventions, a lot of them suggested that they had some reticence about approaching people. They felt they perhaps were undertrained here. So perhaps we need to look at not just a one-shop kind of, one-day course on how to intervene. Almost open up lines of communication between the operator or the service provider and their management about problems that they're having. Perhaps we should make training an ongoing thing, a regular thing, and a regular dialogue. Okay, just to kind of finish up, very briefly looking at, I guess, risks associated for me for new markets, for new players that may be naive to online gambling. From a marketing perspective, given it's a mature market and obviously it's very competitive, there's a real need to compete across bonuses. And also, I think, experienced gamblers like myself are very aware of the need for very complex terms and conditions to avoid any kind of exploitation. And I think that's absolutely true, and it's fair to have those complex terms and conditions for these bonuses. But I think for a new player, this isn't always obvious. And again, for me, it violates our number one objective here, which is informed choice. If something suggests that you get 100% bonus for playing, it shouldn't be the case that the player, when determining whether they should play, has to go through a whole litany of terms and conditions to work out that they actually need to re-gamble that 20 times. So again, if we're thinking about informed choice, we need much more transparency, I think, there. And the final point relates to the point I made about promoting this idea that we need to take RG seriously. And this is something that we need to, basically for all players to consider. Now, most operators are already engaged with this. They already promote responsible gambling. But very simply, what I suggest from the research out there regarding how people attenuate to these messages, when we have gambling marketing, which obviously is going to present gambling as a very positive thing, which it is for the vast majority of people, when we have at the bottom a kind of a strap line, gambling's great fun, but please gamble responsibly. What we see in the lab very simplistically is that people ignore, when the information is slightly incongruent, they will ignore the smaller message and focus on the fact of the positive image of gambling. What I suggest is that it's not that we shouldn't market gambling as being a positive thing. Absolutely we should. It's a legitimate leisure activity. All I'd suggest is that when we're promoting responsible gambling, that we separate it so that there's no confusion and no kind of mixed messages being put out. Thank you very much.